Hello, and welcome to our presentation of Impact of Changes in DCAA Audit Coverage on Prime Contractors. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment and share with you some housekeeping items.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. Moss Adams is pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. For example, you can click the File folder icon to download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by clicking Q&A in the bottom left-hand portion of the icon bar and typing in your question. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. We'll ask polling questions throughout today's presentation. Per the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy webcast CPE standards, CPE credit will be awarded based on your participation in these polls. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. Please have all group members sign the sheet, and please remit only one sheet per group. Also note, today's session will offer you one CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions. CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and is not available to participants who view the on-demand version. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon to open a PDF file you can save to your computer. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances. We're now ready to begin. Thank you.
Presenting today on the impacts of Section 893 is Jeff Witt. Jeff is the Senior Manager in charge of Moss Adams Federal Contracting Risk Management Team. He brings over 25 years of relevant experience in leading government compliance consulting engagements, including assisting clients with developing policies and procedures and controls for compliance with federal acquisition regulations. Prior to joining Moss Adams, Jeff was a lead auditor for the Defense Contract Audit Agency for 10 years. Joining Jeff is Robert Gutierrez. Robert is a manager with Moss Adams Federal Contracting Risk Management Team and brings 8 years of experience as a senior auditor at the Defense Contract Audit Agency. He is a certified public accountant and also has 15 years of experience as an attorney advising owners of all types of businesses. Thank you for your time and your insights today, gentlemen.
Thank you, Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank everyone for attending. It looks like we have a good turnout today. A number of people have signed in, and we think we have an important topic to discuss today, and it's also a timely topic. You know, there's some recent changes that we're going to be discussing that are just hot off the press, really, within the last month or two, that significantly change how things work with regards to audits of government contractors. And so we want to get into some of the details on that. We think there's a lot of people that are also trying to get their arms around these recent changes. And this will be a high-level presentation. Obviously, we only have an hour, so there's not going to be a lot of time to dig into a lot of the nuts and bolts of the details of this, but really to cover what the issues are that everyone's facing, and then to think of some ways that we're going to be following this going forward and possibly presenting additional webinars in the future. We're going to be happy to field any questions. We will be checking on the questions that are submitted, and if we have time and it looks like an appropriate place to answer a question, we'll do so. Otherwise, we'll when we get to the end, hopefully we'll have a few minutes at least, and we can look at some of those questions and try to respond to them. And if not, we will respond after the webinar, because we love those questions. So please ask them. So our agenda today is to talk about some key DCAA audit coverage changes. So really, that's about the audit focus of DCAA and the types of things that they're spending more time auditing these days. We're also going to talk about prime contractor responsibilities, and that's going to lead us into a discussion on changes in audit coverage and how those impact the prime contractor's responsibilities. We're going to talk about DCAA's low-risk sampling process that's been in place for a couple of years and what the impacts of that have been on agencies that rely upon DCAA and on prime contractors and subcontractors that are subject to those audits. We're going to talk about the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act, and in particular the part that deals with changes to DCAA's role based on that act that passed in November. And Robert's going to take us through that in some detail so that we can understand what happened and what is the likely impact of it. And we're going to talk about non-Department of Defense impacts from reduced DCAA audit coverage, and then end with some key takeaways. And we're thinking of this from the perspective of both government agencies, whether it be NASA or Department of Homeland Security or Department of Energy or EPA. We're also thinking of it from the perspective of the prime contractors and the subcontractors. So we're trying to include a little bit of each of those perspectives in this presentation. So with that intro, I'd like to advance the slide and turn it over to Robert.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. Here are some of the latest key DCAA audit coverage changes. Based on my recent experience with DCAA and a lot of the memorandums coming out of DCAA headquarters and changes in law, these are some areas that they're focusing on, or they've changed their focus. The first one, they've significantly reduced their subcontract audit coverage for non-DoD agencies. And we'll go into this in some detail later on in the presentation, but it's a growing area. DCAA's approach to certain allowable and unallowable costs has changed, mainly because the backlog of incurred cost audits has caused DCAA to find more efficient ways or target certain unallowable or allowable costs. Most notably, executive compensation. Before it was check the top 5 and measure the cap, basically the unreasonable compensation cap, and now it's check all executives for reasonable costs. So they're expanding their scope in that area. On the unallowable cost side, there's been some move to standardize the approach to the expressly unallowable costs. And the expressly unallowable costs are those that are subject to penalty. So DCMA, the Defense Contract Management Agency, and DCAA have gotten together to sort of unify their position on which costs are considered expressly unallowable and which costs per FAR are just plain unallowable. Next, we move on to purchasing and estimating system reviews. DCAA had neglected a lot of system reviews when they sort of parked the incurred cost audits for several years, and now they need to catch up. So you'll see a lot of purchasing and estimating system reviews being performed. One, to reduce the scope or lower the risk on an audit, and two, they're just behind several years, and a lot of these systems are more real-time these days and need to be tested in a more current time frame. Moving on to one of the higher priorities of DCAA is always forward pricing. Proposals have always been DCAA's top audit or most important audit, and they've gone to a more real-time audit of the forward pricing rates. In other words, DCAA will start reviewing data related to the contractor's proposal before it's actually submitted to sort of get a jump start on the procedure so that rates can be negotiated rather quickly once the proposal is submitted by the contractor to the ACO or the DACO. In doing a lot of the incurred cost audits, DCAA has found contractors have been expensing project losses on firm fixed contracts in their general administrative rate. So there was a bulletin out, some audit guidance related to that, and so that will be an issue they will always look for in the general administrative pool during an incurred cost audit. A rather new movement is towards reviewing proof of payment. So most firms are on an accrual basis, and their accounting systems record the cost as incurred on an accrual format. FAR actually requires payment of the cost to be claimed. So DCAA is now tracing that cost all the way to a check or some third-party proof of payment. So the whole existence of the cost is basically chased down by DCAA from the initial purchase all the way to the final payment. Intercompany charges have become more of a risk, mainly due to the fact that there's probably less subcontracts and more intercompany type contracts, which are basically just an internal subcontract. So DCAA reviews them in a similar manner. At the larger contractors, DCAA tries to reconcile all the costs to ensure there's no double charging. In other words, they're looking for divisions that say $1,000 went out to Division B from Division A, but then Division B only claimed $800. So there's $200 extra on Division A's claim. And so DCAA is trying to vet all those in order to reconcile it so that all the costs are only included in one claim. And then recently, since 2012, there's been a change in DFARS that requires certain contractors to report their IR&D information to the Defense Technical Information Center website in order to claim those costs as allowable. So DCAA now goes to look to see, did they report it into the DTIC system? And an additional requirement is that the contractor either disapproved the cost as an IRD cost. In other words, it didn't have benefit to the government or the Department of Defense, or they've approved it. And so before allowing the cost, DCAA will check with the contracting officer to determine which IRD projects have been approved or disapproved. So all in all, the main focus is that DCAA's subcontract audit coverage is having the largest impact now on non-DoD prime contractors' compliance. And now I'd like to throw it over to Jeff to continue in the detail with prime contractor responsibility.
Thank you, Robert. Move this forward here. Okay. So prime contractor responsibilities, and this impacts all contractors, whether they're prime or a sub, but it also impacts the agencies involved that have to have controls in place to make sure that the contractors that are doing work for the government are following their responsibilities, meeting their responsibilities. And so we look at FAR 42, and it indicates the prime contractor is responsible for managing and auditing its subcontracts. And so that involves a lot of tasks, a lot of responsibilities. Just a few of those responsibilities include proposal audits. So when there is a proposal that's being submitted and it meets certain thresholds for certified cost or pricing data, that there is an adequate analysis of that performed by the prime contractor, and the agencies are going to want to know that that's happening. And systems adequacy is also a responsibility of the prime, and it's going to depend upon the nature of the prime's contracts with its subs. You know, does the prime have any cost type or flexibly priced subcontracts? If so, then there's going to be a focus on accounting for sure, timekeeping, purchasing systems to make sure that they're adequate to perform on that subcontract. And of course, incurred cost audits is an important prime contractor responsibility. Again, if any of those subs have any flexibly priced nature to them, meaning it could be a T&M, that's considered flexibly priced in this sense. It could be a labor hour contract, it could be a cost type contract. or a number of other contracting vehicles that involve some element of actual cost or hours as being part of the contract versus a fixed price. So the question then is, what happens if audits are not being performed and you have a scenario where those are then either closed out without audit or they remain open contracts? And we've seen situations where there's many years of open contracts at some prime contractors, and then we've also seen situations where there's been contracts that have been closed out without audit. And so the prime contractors and the agencies involved are having to deal with these situations that are really being brought upon because DCAA for years hasn't been auditing subcontracts, and we'll get into the reasons for that in just a second here. So what are the implications of being found non-compliant? If you're a prime contractor working with the government, your reputation is at risk if there's unsatisfactory contract management. So that's a very significant risk to any company that's trying to do business with the government. Your reputation is probably the most important thing you have, and if you get a bad reputation with the government, then it becomes very difficult to do work with them. There's also a financial risk there that the government could disapprove a portion of costs. So if you're a prime contractor and you haven't been able to get audits done of your subcontractors, then the agency involved is going to have to decide what to do about that. They may have to withhold or disallow money from the prime contract to reflect the fact that you haven't met your responsibilities with audits of subcontractors. And then, of course, the administrative nightmare associated with not being able to timely close out contracts is that there can be hundreds or thousands of open contracts. You have to maintain files for all those things, and it becomes a problem when there's 5, 6, 7 years of these open contracts that haven't been resolved, and it involves the obligation of funds, and it is a problem both for the agencies involved and the prime contractors and the subcontractors. So all around, it's not a good situation to not have a timely and efficient process for closing out contracts. Now we want to talk about some of the root causes for the situation that we see out here. And this is one of the root causes, is a change that happened in 2013, really, with DCAA, where they issued a MRD, or a Memorandum from a Regional Director, that indicated their new approach to incurred cost audits. And it was a low-risk approach where if a contract can be identified as meeting low-risk criteria, then it would only have to be sampled, and if in the sense that only, for example, if you had a $25 million incurred cost submission, then it would fall into this category of between $1 million to $50 million, and so it would only have a 5% chance of being audited at all. So 95% of the incurred cost submissions, if they're in this low-risk grouping, would not be audited at all. And so DCAA would just say that they met their responsibility because they applied this risk assessment approach. And so it ultimately resulted in thousands and thousands of incurred cost claims that are not being audited by DCAA. So in the history behind that, those that have been following DCAA for a long time know that it's been an interesting history where they've received criticism over the years. For example, the Office of Inspector General criticized DCAA for not meeting generally accepted government auditing standards, and so DCAA responded in ways where they did focus and perform more work on the audits that they were doing so that they could protect themselves from that criticism, that their audits were very robust and therefore met all the requirements of GAGAS, but they didn't get any more people to do that, really. So then the backlog started to grow because They were focusing on certain audits and doing them to a great level of detail, and those audits could take a year or more to complete, and all the while the backlog continued to grow. So this was their intended solution, I think, to that backlog problem, is to risk away the majority of the incurred cost submissions that are out there. And so maybe a contractor might think that's a good thing, that they weren't selected for audit, but it also creates some uncertainty for them, because ultimately the agencies involved have to also cover their risk. And if there's thousands of incurred cost submissions that were never audited by DCAA, that puts the agency, NASA, Department of Homeland Security, EPA, any of the agencies involved, it puts them in a difficult situation, including DoD, where how do they address this fact that so many of these incurred cost submissions have not been audited, and DCAA is saying they will not be audited? So that's kind of an interesting situation that we're in, and it's caused a lot of the issues that we're talking about today. So with that, I think we're ready for our first polling question.
Great. So under DCAA's current audit sampling approach, if a submission has been identified as low risk, what's the probability that the submission will be selected for audit if the submission includes $25 million of auditable costs? As a reminder, for those of you who may have joined us late, please select the button to the left of your answer and press the Submit button in order for your answer to be recorded. We'll give this just another few seconds and close the polls. And we'll take a look at our results.
All right, so it looks like 62% indicated 5%, which is the correct answer based on the previous slide. Most of you are right online with what's going on there, that it's a very small percentage chance that submission would be audited. So what does it take to get into the low-risk sampling grouping? There's a number of requirements for that. In essence, you can't have one of these situations that we're listing here. So if a contractor has a known fraud that was applicable to the proposed year, you're kicked out of the low-risk category. If there's a pre-award accounting system opinion of unacceptable, or no prior experience with the contractor, or business system deficiencies, or significant question costs in a prior year audit, then that contractor is not going to fall into that low-risk category, and there's a much higher likelihood that DCAA will audit that incurred cost submission. So what are the results of the 2013 MRD that went to this low-risk approach? One of the results is that incurred cost proposals under $1 million are never audited, if they're falling into the low-risk category, or if they're from $1 million to $100 million, they're very infrequently being audited. And then, the ones that are larger are still receiving audit coverage, although they are still behind in their years. So they may be auditing 2012 at a larger contractor and not 2014. But eventually they will be auditing those larger incurred cost submissions. The interesting thing about how this approach impacts everyone is that I think it's fair to say that smaller contractors in general have less robust controls over unallowables. Large government contractors tend to have whole rooms full of people that are familiar with government compliance. They may have had a prior DCMA or DCAA background, and they help those larger companies institute controls. And so those are the companies that are getting audited, the ones that have the controls. And the incurred cost submissions for the smaller contractors are now less likely to be audited, even though they're the ones that are probably more likely to have unallowable costs. So this approach drastically impacts what DCAA audits. It impacts all the agencies involved that are procuring work through contractors because of the issues they have to deal with regards to lack of coverage of either prime or subcontract audits. And for contractors, it creates uncertainty. They don't know what the situation is and whether they're ultimately could be still subject to an audit. So it also has resulted in the backlog that we talked about, where there's many years still of open incurred cost audits that haven't been dealt with, even though DCAA has gone to the low-risk sampling approach. And with that, I'd like to pass it back over to Robert.
Thank you, Jeff. We have some recent legislation impacting DCAA. It's not often that the annual National Defense Authorization Act impacts DCAA, but in the 2016 version, there was a section 893, which now prevents DCAA from auditing non-DoD agencies if there's an incurred cost backlog of 18 months. The Secretary of Defense is supposed to certify that, and we'll probably find out more about that later, especially this spring when DCAA issues its annual report. In addition to that, Congress provided a disincentive for DCAA to audit a non-defense agency. Beginning with the next FY, so after September 30, 2016, DCAA's budget will be reduced dollar for dollar related to any reimbursement they receive from a non-defense agency. So if they go out and audit a NASA contract and get paid for it by NASA, DCAA's budget will be reduced by that amount. So that sort of creates a disincentive for DCAA to go tackle the non-defense agency work. In addition, there's a definition of what the incurred cost inventory is. It's a hard subject to define. You would think you could define it rather easily, but Congress sort of made it ambiguous. But it's supposed to mean the level of contractor incurred cost proposals in the inventory from prior fiscal years that are currently being audited by DCAA. As we'll see later, there's a couple ways you can go about defining that level. As a result of this legislation, we have an increased burden on non-DoD prime contractors because now DCAA is not auditing the subcontractors. And as Jeff spoke before, even with this low-risk sampling, the subcontractors are being missed out by a DCAA audit. And so now the prime contractors are now required or will now have to deal with the issue of auditing their subcontractors. Failure to do so has resulted in and increases the exposure to that agency disallowing in some of those subcontractor costs. And we have our next poll question.
So Section 893 of the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act restricts DCAA from performing audits of low-risk contractors, of closed contracts, of non-DoD agency contracts, all of the above, or none of the above. Please select your answer and press the Submit button. And we'll prepare to close the poll and take a look at our results.
Okay, it looks like most everyone got the right answer there. The non-DoD agency contracts are the ones that DCAA is now prevented from auditing so long as there's a backlog in excess of 18 months. So how do we define that backlog? So we can do it the simple numerical method. Based on reports to Congress, DCAA averages about 7,500 incurred cost proposals per year. So if we multiply that by 1.5, an 18-month backlog would be 11,250 proposals. However, this is pretty biased on all those audits that are not going to happen because of the low-risk sampling. And the high-dollar audits, which are also high resource audits. In other words, it takes more auditors, more staff for DCAA to audit, are going to be included in that inventory, and maybe, as we'll see when we do it by dollar value, it's a totally different perspective. If we look at the FY 2014 ending balance in the report to Congress, there are 11,300 auditable proposals valued at roughly $400 billion. However, in that same time frame, we had 6,800 proposals waiting to be audited. So they were more recent proposals, not the prior fiscal year, but the current fiscal year. Or there were proposals waiting to become adequate. Maybe DCAA didn't feel all the schedules were applied, or they weren't properly supported at the time to audit. They weren't basically unauditable proposals, so they were kicked back. But those 6,800 also added up to $400 billion. So you can see if we go in a numerical method, that 6,800 maybe next year would qualify, and there wouldn't be an 18-month backlog if we used a simple numeric method. However, the dollar value is the same. We'll find out this spring when DCAA issues its report to Congress, and we'll see how the Secretary of Defense decides to measure that backlog. Now, moving on to an impact to the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy's Office of Inspector General did a couple special reports, basically focusing on subcontractor audit coverage. So first, they looked at the management and operating contractors. These are the very large M&O contractors that run the labs, such as Lawrence Livermore Labs, Sandia Labs, Los Alamos. They have a lot of subcontractors underneath. Now, in those contracts, the Department of Energy provided that an audit of a subcontractor could be done by the internal audit department of the contractor, an external auditor, or DCAA. Well, now we know DCAA isn't going to do any of those audits, so the M&O contractor is going to have to rely on an internal audit or the external auditors. However, between 2010 and 2012, the IG found a lot of subcontractor audit weaknesses at 9 of the M&O contractors, basically most of the labs. They either failed to audit, in other words, they didn't request an audit, didn't perform an audit, or in one case, a contractor had made the threshold so high that none of the subcontractors fell or were above the threshold and thus were not audited. Or we had some inadequate audits, mainly due to internal audit departments where there wasn't proper independence, or there was lack of objectivity, or a lack of knowledge and due professional care. These audits represented $900 million in subcontracts during those 2 years. So the Department of Energy was fairly concerned. In addition, they found that there was no standard audit approach amongst the contractors, nor was there consistent oversight by the Department of Energy. So the IG determined the risk to the Department of Energy was mainly paying for unallowable costs that an audit would have found that were unallowable pursuant to FAR. Another issue was these audits, due to DCAA delays, were well past the 3-year record retention period for cost data. And so it was very extremely difficult to audit. And even more so, the 6-year statute of limitation was almost running on some of these contracts. And so there was even more pressing need to do more work on these audits that wasn't done either by DCAA or the contractors. And once again, we see the burden falling on the non-DoD prime contractor of timely auditing the subcontractors, especially within the 3 years of final payment. Otherwise, there may be a problem with disallowance of the subcontractor costs. So the IG recommended that there be a standard audit approach applied to ensure sufficient coverage of the subcontractors, and then ensure these audits meet some professional standards. Next, we had another report by the IG. This focused on the non-M&O contractors, so the smaller contractors under the Department of Energy. This was in 2015, so we had about 1.5 years of DCAA's low-risk sampling. Basically, they found out that DCAA could not meet any of the needs for the Department of Energy in a timely manner, basically large incurred cost backlog, And the low-risk sampling excluded 80% of the energy non-M&O contracts from an automatic audit. So they only had 20% coverage of those contracts. The recommendations were, one, to try and coordinate with DCAA to develop a risk approach that would reduce the backlog of all these unaudited incurred cost proposals, as well as tailor the DCAA low-risk sample to basically bias it towards more, say, NASA and Department of Energy contracts so that they could get adequate coverage there. But with the lack of resources for DCAA, that wasn't likely to happen. They also developed a strategy to supplement where DCAA was not going to be auditing. Basically hire outside firms to perform an independent incurred cost audit that would follow DCAA requirements and was also GAGAS compliant or compliant with the generally accepted government auditing standards. Now, the costs associated with these audits are generally a valid contract cost that a contractor could bill to the government under the most cost type and time and material contracts, typically via the overhead pool. Now we have our next polling question.
So per the DOE OIG report on incurred cost audit coverage, DCAA low-risk sampling excludes what percentage of the DOE non-M&O contracts from automatic audits? And we'll give everyone just a little bit more time. Record your answer. And we'll prepare to close the polls and see our results.
So it looks like most everybody got the 80% we were looking for. We'll move on. So what did DOE do? In their IG Audit Handbook, they created a chapter on contractor audit guidance and also included a sample audit program for contractors. So this could be used by the internal audit on a way to structure their department or the audit in a way that will comply with the Department of Energy standards, as well as supply additional guidance to an external auditor. They also, through their acquisition guide, created a chapter on subcontract audit procedures. So that way, Department of Energy would be consistent throughout the whole agency on how they handled subcontract audits. Now, moving on to NASA, they had a little different problem, and they have a couple of different characteristics from the Department of Energy. What you see here is from the FAR. It's the basic time frame in which you should close out a contract. And you see at the top we have purchase orders, delivery orders, and task orders basically closed within 90 days. Firm fixed contracts should be closed within 6 months. So these are things that don't take a lot of audits. They're just a lot of paperwork to finish up. But you notice in the fourth box, cost reimbursable, time and material, and labor hour audits should be closed within 3 years that they physically are completed. And what we've learned from the prior slides is that DCAA is a lot further behind than 3 years on these audits, and so we're not in compliance with FAR when it comes to keeping up with contract closeouts. Now, NASA is a little different than some agencies. They tend to close their contracts by center, and you'll see a list of this, basically all the space centers under NASA. The blue line represents the backlog of agency contracts. So these are contracts waiting to be closed. They can be physically complete, but they haven't been administratively closed yet. The red line represents their contractor. So NASA is unique in it has a contractor that closes out contracts for them. It doesn't handle all of them, as you can see. It handles a good portion in the NSSC, which is a shared service center that NASA uses to close out contracts. So you can see there's a backlog of about 20,000 contracts. And now the impact to NASA of not closing out contracts in time is they are late in deobligating funds. In other words, releasing funds to be used for other projects or new projects or returned to the Treasury. So the IG under NASA sampled 5,200 closed instruments. They call them instruments because they have other things such as grants and cooperative agreements. They're not all cost-type contracts or fixed price-type contracts. So you can see on the table here we have average days late in the third column there, and we can see, well, for task orders, purchase orders, they're 180 days late, but our prior slide said they should basically finish in 90 days, so we're double the limit there. But there's only $7,000 there. But if we look at the high dollar items, we see cost type contracts. Average days late, 2,400, so there's 8 years late. And that's a lot due to DCAA's incurred cost backlog, which are required for all the cost type contracts to close out. So this is a sample of only 200 items, which resulted in $400,000 of funds that haven't been de-obligated yet. So if you project that over the whole universe of 5,200, you'll end up with $17 million. So then it becomes a very substantial amount of money to NASA. They'd like to use that $17 million for new contracts or other projects. So I'll turn it over to Jeff now to discuss the NASA issues in a little more detail.
Thank you, Robert. Yes, there's a NASA OIG special report. There's one on award closeout processes and one on incurred cost coverage. And there's the conditions that were noted there is that NASA centers have inconsistent closeout procedures. The personnel are not dedicated to and diligent in the closeout process, and that NASA encourages centers to use closeout contractors, but that's not required. So that was mentioned in our previous slide, the use of the closeout contractor. So the risks to NASA that was mentioned in those reports is the increased risk of paying unallowable, unreasonable, and unallocable incurred costs. So those are similar to what we're seeing for other agencies. The risk of not having timely audits done are those same risks. And the risk of losing the opportunity to recoup improper costs because agency contracting officers rely too heavily on DCAA's incurred cost audit process. So this report was done before the NDAA change, when DCAA could have and was doing some incurred cost audits for NASA. So now it's a different situation than mentioned in that report, because DCAA is precluded from being able to do those audits for NASA at this point. And we don't, as Robert mentioned, are they going to get down to the 18-month backlog and possibly start doing audits again for some agencies? Who knows? We know that DCAA has put pencils down at this point, and even if they were in the middle of doing an incurred cost audit for any non-DoD agency, they were told to stop work on any of those audits, and we don't know if that will ever change, because they're going to be hard-pressed to get down to an 18-month backlog. NASA contracting officers generally wait for a DCAA audit, and that was mentioned in the report. Now they don't even have the option of waiting for a DCAA audit. And NASA's internal controls do not account for the significant reduction in DCAA oversight. All kind of water under the bridge now because of the change with Section 893 of the NDAA. So following on with analysis of those reports, the recommendations were to standardize closeout processes agency-wide, and I believe NASA is making some progress in that regard, and establishing time frames to close out contracts, and to revise the NASA Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement to allow independent public accounting firms to provide supplemental audit coverage for NASA contracts where the DCAA cannot be responsive. So now NASA in particular is made it specifically clear in its FAR supplement that since DCAA is not available to do the audits, the contracting officers can go out, and it's unclear whether that's going to be done on a contracting officer basis or if there's going to be more of a centralized approach to resolving that situation. So strengthen controls to ensure NASA contracting officers are performing and documenting periodic compensation reviews for cost reimbursement service contracts with potential value in excess of $500,000. So that was another recommendation that came out of those reports. And another point that we wanted to make at the bottom here is that in addition to what we're talking about with prime contracts for NASA, the NASA contractors are exposed to the same subcontract audit compliance exposure that we discussed for DOE and other non-DoD contractors. So They also have the issues of DCAA not performing any audits of NASA subcontractor costs. Next, we wanted to discuss the NASA procurement notice of December 2015. So this came very quickly after the change, after the national disclosure, or after the NDAA, excuse me, was passed in November of 2015. The NASA issued a procurement notice, and it revised the FAR supplement, Section 1815, to clarify when contracting officers can use a contractor. So they addressed that recommendation from the report we were talking about and actually changed their FAR supplement. And so this was a helpful development to address the risks that the agency is facing. It was a proactive approach, and hopefully other agencies will follow this approach to clarify how they're going to address the situation. I think we're ready for another polling question.
Thank you, Jeff. The recent revision to the NASA FAR Supplement, Section 1815, provides that contracting officers may elect to close flexibly priced contracts without audit, utilize outside contractors to perform audits, have ACO staff perform reviews prior to closeout instead of audits, have DCAA perform incurred cost audits when other options are not available. Please select your answer and press the Submit button. And we'll prepare to close the polls. And view the responses.
Yep, it looks like just about everyone utilize outside contractors to perform audits, and that was the correct answer there. And some of the other possible answers, the first one being to elect to close flexibly priced contracts without audit, that's not an option. There's, as Robert mentioned, there's still the requirement that any flexibly priced contracts require an audit, incurred cost audit. Although, as we mentioned, DCAA may not be the one to perform those now. The third option was to have ACO staff perform reviews prior to closeout instead of audits, and that's not the answer because the ACO staff, they don't have the staff, enough staff to do that, even if they wanted to, or the background likely to be able to take over for the role of DCAA. And the fourth option is to have DCAA perform incurred cost audits when other options are not available. As we mentioned, Section 893 specifically prohibits DCAA from performing those incurred cost audits, no matter whether they're requested to by an agency or not. So we wanted to get to the final part of the presentation, and we broke the key takeaways into basically a subcontract audit slide and then a prime contract audit slide. I think there's different issues that are affecting these and some that they have in common, but with regards to subcontract audits, the prime contractor's failure to timely audit subcontractors will likely result in significant amounts of disallowed cost. Once the agency involved learns that there's flexibly priced contracts that is ultimately rolling up into what the government is paying for. So if you have a flexibly priced subcontract that rolls up into a flexibly priced prime contract, ultimately that's all cost-based, and the government is paying whatever has been submitted to it on monthly public vouchers in the case of flexibly priced contracts. And so if those were then never audited to determine whether the indirect rates are allowable, the direct costs are allowable, then once the agency learns of that situation, it's a difficult situation for everyone. And if the contracts were closed out already, the subcontracts, then it's more difficult because there's no way then for the prime to go back and try to recoup that from the sub, even if they would like to. But the agencies involved will likely say, we've been harmed by that, because if there had been audits done, there would have likely been unallowables that were identified, there would have been adjustments, and because of the lack of audits being performed, we're paying more, the government is paying more, and there will have to be an adjustment for that. And DCAA, we know, is not able to provide subcontractor and incurred cost submission audits for non-DoD contractors. We know that now for several reasons. They weren't doing it before anyway, but they're certainly not doing it now based on Section 893. Prime contractors are determining whether to perform the audits with internal staff or to outsource the audits to accounting firms. So those are options to consider if you're a prime contractor, and I think the agencies involved would want to have some input to that as well, given independence considerations. If you have an internal audit staff that ultimately, once they do the audit, they pass that audit over to procurement within their prime contractor, who then negotiates with the subcontractor based on the results of the audit. There are some independence considerations there. And so there's really a lot of thought going on, I think, around the country within the various agencies and the impacted contractors with regards to how to address the situation. And the incurred cost audits are complex. They require an in-depth understanding of applicable audit techniques. It's not something that you would just want to hire a CPA firm that has not an in-depth background in performing federal contract incurred cost audits. We have a team, in our case, of DCAA auditors that has many years of experience, and that's what we feel is necessary to be able to even attempt to do these. And there's still a challenge because we're dealing mostly with contractors that fell below the threshold of DCAA audit, and therefore they're the ones that are less likely to have robust controls in place. So it is a challenging audit to perform, and it's one that you really want to think about whether those performing the audit have the required skill set. And I think in many cases, prime contractors are choosing to outsource these audits to ensure the audits are independent and meet applicable standards. Talking about then prime contractor audit coverage. So this is where agencies are thinking about how are we going to deal with this recent Section 893 change to the NDAA. Now that we know, at least for now, and could be for a long time, if forever, DCAA will not be auditing the non-DoD contracts. And it impacts more than just incurred cost audits. In a lot of cases, DCAA is the approver of public vouchers. And so how does that work now that DCAA can't do that work anymore? How do contractors get paid when there's no DCAA person that can do their review of the public voucher? And each agency, whether it be DOE or NASA or Department of Homeland Security or EPA or any of the many agencies that are there, they're all looking at this, and some of them are developing kind of the same approach, which is going to the option of an outsourced contractor or CPA firm to perform the audits. Others are trying to decide how they want to address the situation. And DOE and NASA's response, as we know, is to start utilizing outside CPA firms in many cases to perform the audits. And we definitely are going to be tracking this, and we're definitely going to be providing additional information as it becomes available. You can be certain of that. And so with that, I don't know if we've received any questions or not. Maybe we could
Jeff,
check
we
that.
did receive a few, but in order to stay on track for time, we're going to go ahead and conclude. Thank you so much. If you do continue to have questions, or if you submitted a question we did not get to, either Robert or Jeff will follow up with you directly, provide you the shorter answer or the long answer as you need it. If you find you have questions along the way, please don't hesitate to reach out to them. Thank you so much, Robert and Jeff. I really, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.